Hello, and welcome to the Sentinel Innovation and Methods Seminar Series. My name is Rishi Desai. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and I will be moderating today's session. The US FDA Sentinel system helps to address questions related to safety and effectiveness of marketed medical products. The Innovation Center focuses on developing innovative methods and Sentinel by leveraging new data sources, building new tools, and enhancing real-world evidence capabilities through advanced analytics. The Sentinel Operations Center maintains FDA's active risk identification and analysis system. We launched this webinar series a couple of years ago to engage experts and innovators in key areas related to Innovation Center's master plan and Operations Center's methods work. With that, I'm really pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Seamus Kent. Dr. Kent is a senior advisor at the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE, in the UK. He led NICE's recently released real-world evidence framework, which was published in June. He has an academic background in health economics and medical statistics. The title of this presentation is Advancing the Use of Real-World Evidence for Health Technology Assessment, the NICE Real-World Evidence Framework. Of course, this is a topic that we deeply care about in the community, in the pharmacoepidemiology community, and we are really pleased to see when this guidance document came out, because it's really nicely lays out all the complexities that you need to encounter when you are working with real-world evidence. So I'm very curious to hear what Seamus about his experience developing this and how he sees this as moving forward. Before getting started, I would like to mention that your lines are muted. If you'd like to pose a question, please type them into your Zoom question and answer feature. We will answer all the questions at the end. And finally, this session is being recorded and will be made available through the Sentinel webpage, which can be found at sentinelinitiatives.org. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Kent, and again, thank him for joining us today.
Very much, Rishi, and thank you everybody for joining the seminar today. So, as Rishi said, I'm going to be talking about real-world evidence in health technology assessments. I'm going to talk about where we currently are with it, how we're currently using it, and where we want to get to, and describe some of the key challenges that account for that gap between where we are and where we want to be. I've illustrated this here with a colleague on a desperate search for high-quality real-world data. And I'm also going to talk about the real-world evidence framework, which we published last year. It's meant to try and help us overcome some of these challenges and improve the use of real-world evidence, and ultimately improve the recommendations that we make at NICE. I'll start with something akin to a statement of intent. NICE published a 5-year strategy a couple of years ago describing its ambition. So it talked about the need for faster, more rapid, more responsive technology evaluations, ensuring faster patient access to new innovative treatments, and also about dynamic living guidelines. That is key. And together these speak to a learning health system approach. And then third, thinking about using data to understand the uptake of our guidance and to drive improvements in that. And it's recognized in this strategy document that real-world data, real-world evidence is really an essential ingredient to actually achieving these aims. But before I get into real-world evidence, I think it's probably useful to have a bit of a primer on health technology assessment. I imagine that the majority of regulatory background, so I think it's good to describe HTA and some of the differences to regulators, as these do have an impact on our uses of data. So in short, what health technology assessment bodies and payers do is make decisions about the coverage and reimbursement of technologies. In some countries, like in England, we have a health technology assessment body, NICE, and then we have a different payer, which is the NHS. So we make recommendations to that payer. In some countries, these functions are combined. In the US, as an example, we have payers and not the HTA body in quite the same way. So these bodies generally make recommendations by comparing new technologies against local standard of care. and they focus on clinical effectiveness, focusing on different patient outcomes. At NICE, we explicitly state that we're interested in how a patient functions, feels, or how long they survive. So in general, or in principle, we're not really interested in surrogate outcomes like progression-free survival or the demonic impact on these kinds of patient outcomes. In some of our programs, we're also interested in system outcomes, so things like resource use, costs, impact on clinical pathways. So most HTA bodies do clinical effectiveness assessments in one way or another. A subset, which includes NICE, also look at cost effectiveness. And this is about understanding whether a new treatment offers value for money for the healthcare system. In the NHS in England, we have a fixed annual budget for our healthcare system and need to make optimal use of that resource. So we use a methodology called incremental costs per quality adjusted life year, or cost per quality. And we're interested in this over the patient lifetime, so not just the duration, say, of a clinical trial. And because we don't observe outcomes of over the lifetime of a patient, typically, these are usually informed by some economic modeling. We also take into account other attributes in our decisions, such as unmet need, disease severity, societal impacts, uncertainty, safety, and so on. So with this description, I think there's a few important to highlight in difference versus regulation. One is perhaps that the importance of comparison against the standard of care or other active treatments, and also our interest in treatment policies. So we're not just interested in the effects of using a technology, but more in the effects of providing that technology and what happens to patients over the lifetime from initiating it. Our focus is on effectiveness rather than efficacy, and also in particular on estimating the size of that effect, because we need to weigh the benefits that effect size brings against the additional costs of the new treatment. So given this methodology for making our recommendations, there are a huge range of use cases where real-world data can be extremely valuable. And I've tried to order these in groups in some way that relates to their impact on recommendations, or equally conceive of this in terms of risk. So at the left-hand side, you have lower risk use cases, which are really about understanding populations, interventions, disease or outcomes. We often want to use this data for economic modeling, for example, to estimate background event rates, natural history of disease, resource use, or costs. And another example would be using real-world data to understand the applicability of global clinical trials to patients in the NHS. And for most of these use cases, real-world data is a priori the kind of data that we're interested in if it relates to the population of interest, reflects patterns of routing, and is up to date, reflecting contemporary practice. So we're really trying to encourage the greater use of this data in these areas, but we often see it insufficiently used. So often our economic models are built based on the control arms in clinical trials. So a really good example of the issues that this can have comes from a recent publication by ICER in the US, which they did with HTA, where they looked at exacerbation rates in hereditary angioedema and found that these were much higher in the trial than they were among the target population in routine. Because a higher background rate of events means a higher absolute benefits for a given relative risk, this led to the technology being seen as more cost effective than it was in reality. So really important to use data on routine care for these use cases. Then at the higher end, we have the causal estimation use cases. So what is the effect of an intervention on patient health outcomes? And of course, this is a bit more challenging, but there is an increasing realization of the potential value of real-world evidence in complementing randomized trials in answering a broader range of questions about the effects of technologies in routine settings. And this interest has really been driven and informed by some of the work in Harvard Medical School and FDA, like the RCT duplicate project. And there are many ways in which this could be used. And I think many of these will probably be familiar to the audience, such as extending estimates from trials to populations who are excluded from them or underrepresented in those trials, and potentially exploring the presence of heterogeneity or variation in these treatment effects across population groups. We might use off-label data to extend to new indications, perhaps to provide head-to-head comparisons for drugs. So an interesting example of this is based on work that we at NICE have done in partnership with HTA. So we identified that NICE has approved a number of different DOACs for stroke prevention in patients with atrial fibrillation. And each of these evaluations is based on trials, randomized trials, comparing a DOAC against warfarin. But because we were interested in DOACs against DOACs, we had to perform network meta-analyses to provide evidence of this. And that comes with their own methodological challenges, given the differences in trial characteristics and so on. So there's a real value in having head-to-head data to support or to complement this evidence. We also often want that the data from clinical trials can often be limited for our HTA decisions. We're interested in clinical outcomes like overall survival, and we're interested in patient perspective. And often this data can be quite immature for trials. So we might want to model that data over longer time periods, for example. So there's great potential to incorporate this kind of evidence into our decision-making. But for this to be done effectively, the processes really need to be there to enable it. And at the moment, I would argue that they're not quite there. We rarely reassess new drugs, for example. There is a process that allows it, but this tends to be driven by major safety concerns or the publication of new trials which provide very different conclusions thought of recently. But we're moving towards new ways of working that will allow us to incorporate real-world evidence in a more consistent way. The other area where real-world evidence can be used for assessing effectiveness, of course, are initial assessments. But here, the use of this data is inherently limited by the fact that, almost by definition, that data on the intervention of interest hasn't yet accrued. So there is an opportunity to use data from jurisdictions with faster approval of medicine. We've been doing some work in NICE in partnership with Flatiron, looking at the possibility of using cancer data from the US to inform our appraisals on the basis that regulatory approval tends to happen on average about 6 months faster in the US than it does in Europe. But really, if you look at what happens in practice, the use of real-world data tends to be limited to producing an external control arm to a single-arm trial. And this has been a massive increase in the number of drugs presenting information from uncontrolled diseases and oncology, which of course won't come as a surprise to you. This is illustrated by a figure on the right-hand side, which you don't need to see the details of, but you can just see the rate of growth. I think it's worth mentioning at this point that HTA bodies are really beholden to the data that regulators accept. It's very difficult for HTA bodies to incentivize companies to undertake new randomized controlled trials to support the needs of HTA bodies, and regulators accept certain kinds of evidence. That tends to be what we see down the line in HTA. So we see this big increase in use of external control arms. In HTA, it's not where there's single arm trials. Sometimes you have randomized controlled trials where the comparator drug is not available in the UK, so we need to use external data for the relevant UK standard of care. And this is increasingly a problem in complex clinical areas where there's many different alternative treatments and complex pathways. So we're seeing a lot of this, and this is an area of interest. But there are currently big challenges in trying to use this data to make decisions. And part of this comes from the quality of the evidence submitted on external controls. So there's a few things that I wanted to bring out. I think the first thing to note is that actually currently around half of external control arms are based on prior clinical trial data. I think there's certainly evidence that we're seeing more and more use of real world data rather than clinical trials, partly because of new biomarker driven therapies where there aren't clinical trial on the relevant comparator to draw on. But it's still preferred, I think, by committees to real world data, although this is changing. In terms of evidence quality, though, I think it's worth noting that the majority of studies are still based on naive comparisons. If you look at the red box at the bottom, you can see this. So 60% of external control arms were naive comparisons, which means there wasn't an attempt to adjust for known confounding factors. What's more, we see little of any consideration given to some of the other study design challenges, which we know from work from this group, among many others, to be extremely important determinants of validity. Very little discussion of time zero, for example. We also see insufficient or uninformative sensitivity analyses, limited transparency. This is somewhat hinted at by the fact that there's quite a large category of cases here described as undefined real-world data study because insufficient information was provided to in these reports to really identify what it was. And then a more recently recognized problem is whether the right analytical methods have been used given the estimand of interest. So I've hinted at this here, but I'll make some of these points more concrete around the challenges in using real world evidence. And I divided this into two parts. The first is about evidence quality and the second more about processes. So evidence quality, there is insufficient or limited trust sometimes in real world evidence studies by our decision-making committees. At NICE, we have independent groups who make recommendations. And this is partly driven by this limited transparency that I talked about earlier. There's often voiced concerns around poor data quality. Of course, the data generally, real world data, was not collected for the purposes to which it's been put in HTA, but rather to inform clinical care, for auditing, for billing, or whatever. And this can lead to informational challenges from missing data, mismeasurements that create biases. Biases can, of course, also arise from these real-world databases, time-related biases, and, of course, confounding in comparative studies. I think it's also important to recognize that a major challenge is around accessing high-quality, relevant data sources in a timely manner, and we're doing work to try and facilitate this in the UK. The processes need to be placed to accommodate the use of real-world evidence. I think it's important to recognize that, conducting real-world evidence studies and evaluating is quite a hard, complex process, and we need the expertise and capacity to do this well. And there's been, in our opinion, a lack of clear, consolidated guidance on what HTA bodies want in terms of real-world evidence studies. And that's something that we've tried to address with our real-world evidence framework. So this was published in June 2022. And what we wanted to do was to encourage the use of real-world evidence to fill evidence gaps and improve our recommendations. We wanted to improve the quality and transparency of the evidence that we and enable informed critical appraisal of these studies and engender or create trust in studies where warranted. And we do this by clearly describing where data can be used to improve our recommendations and how, and also describing best practices for planning, conducting, and reporting of real-world evidence studies. So, of course, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There's huge amounts of work that have been done describing best practices in various publications by academic bodies, regulators, HTA, and research institutions, which have been extremely valuable and extremely useful. So really, our framework is about trying to pull these together in a way that's meaningful for health technology assessment. A lot of that research or that work is from a regulatory perspective, and bringing it together in a way that is useful for our partners. So we did this in-house, and we held a series of multi-stakeholder workshops in November and January this year, and then open consultation in April before publication. Just before I get into the to provide a definition, we've adopted a very broad definition of real-world data as data collected outside of clinical trials that relates to patient health or experiences or routine care delivery. And it's not exactly the same as the FDA's definition, but in practice, I don't think it deviates that much. And there's a huge overlap in the kinds of real-world, or the kind of data sources which we would be interested in. So routinely collected sources like EHR data, data collected for certain research projects, or things like patient registries, cohort studies, surveys, and increasing generated health data. So to come onto the framework, we define 3 principles of high quality evidence generation. The first is that evidence should be generated in a transparent way and with integrity, from study planning through to study conduct and reporting. The data should be trustworthy, that is of good and known provenance, and relevant and of sufficient quality to answer the specific research question of interest. And that the methods used, the study design and methods used, address the key risks of bias and characterize uncertainty. In an earlier slide, there are many uses to which we can put real-world data, and the depth of reporting and the detail of analysis should be proportionate to this use case or this risk. And really the rest of the framework is about trying to implement these principles across these different use cases. Now, usually at this point, talking about the framework, I'd just describe our recommendations. What I want to do here is briefly touch on some of them, but try and bring out some of the challenges that we had from stakeholders through consultation, where we may have recommended best practice, or what we consider best practice from the literature, but there was some pushback about how realistic that was, or whether it's really valuable. So starting with planning studies, there's nothing here which is particularly groundbreaking. We try and put emphasis on pre-specification of study protocols. At the moment in HTA, we're really a long way from this. When we receive submissions, there's very few examples of real-world evidence studies ahead of time, and we're really trying to encourage this. We didn't quite go as far to mandate it at this stage. Perhaps that's something that can happen in the future, but there's many, I think, challenges to be ironed out in terms of exactly at what point in the process that protocol should be provided, how we deal with changes to it, how we deal with the complexities of data curation and analytical decisions and so on, and even where this protocol should be published. We also recommended initially in our draft framework that systematic reproduce were taken to identifying data. Again, there was some pushback on this in recognizing the challenges of really doing systematic searches for real-world data sources, given the, at the moment, perhaps insufficient registries of data which have high quality metadata that allow you to kind of do the work you'd want to. But nevertheless, we put a lot of emphasis on justifying your choices of real-world evidence sources. In terms of conducting studies, we try and provide some general guidance around applicable across both descriptive studies and causal estimation studies, and provide some sort of general points around this. So ensuring that the study is relevant to the research question, the methods and design, address the risk of bias, and that they're valid and reliable, and that the robustness of results is assessed given the key causes of uncertainty which might arise from data curation, study design, statistical modeling, or limitations of the data. We provide more detailed guidance on causal estimation I'll come to shortly. And then finally, in reporting studies. So as I said, this is an extremely important component of the purpose of the framework. I think currently the quality or level of reporting isn't sufficient to really create that trust in the evidence that we need to use this data routinely, especially in the absence of randomized trials where there are major uncertainties in the evidence base. So reporting should be sufficient to enable independent researchers to reproduce the results, for enable our committees and groups to interpret the results and fully understand its strengths and weaknesses. And reporting should cover everything from how you identify your sources, data sources, how you describe them, the data curation and analysis, so what was done to the data, how may this impact on results from that initial data set to the analytical sample, the study design, the statistical methods applied to this data, and of course, results from all studies, whether planned or unplanned. I think just one point to pick up here around data curation and analysis, we in alignment with a lot of other guidance, including I think the FDA's, we encourage the sharing of analytical code and want full information about data curation. I think there's a lot of challenges from our stakeholders around issues around IP, which still need to be dealt with, I think. But there's also the question from a HTA body of what we can really do with that code. We're quite resource constrained, whether we have the capacity to use this in a meaningful way to improve our decisions is something that's, I think, open to question. And the other thing is, as we do throughout the framework, is really try and point to best practices that have been developed elsewhere. So we point to tools like RWE to help guide the companies who submit evidence to NICE what good looks like. So in terms of assessing data suitability, we have a separate section on this. And this again is informed by the work of Duke Margolis, the FDA, among others. And we make a distinction between data provenance and fitness for purpose. So data provenance is somewhat independent particular application, and it's really about our understanding of where the data came from, how it was collected, and what settings and by who, what quality management, quality assurances, processes did the data go through, and what are the governance arrangements surrounding the data. And all this is really about understanding how much we can trust the data, whether it's reasonable for us to use it to inform public health decisions. Fitness for purpose, on the other hand, is really about the specific use case, recognizing that a given source of data may be useful for one question, but not for another. And here we make a distinction between data quality and data relevance. For data quality, we really want to understand the completeness and accuracy of our key study variables, so our population eligibility criteria, our interventions, comparators, outcomes, key confounders, and so on. We want information on this accuracy, and ideally we want sort of gold standard approaches to assessing this. Of course, this isn't possible in many situations, so instead this really needs to be explored through sensitivity analysis. I think currently the information we have around data accuracy, data validation is relatively limited, and we really want to see more of this. But we need to do further work on exactly what we want to see, I think. In terms of data relevance, there are a number of important questions to ask. So some are around data content. Does it contain the variables we need measured with sufficient granularity to answer the research question of interest in a reliable way? We have questions that speak to the generalizability or transparency of the results. So about the populations included in the data, the care settings and treatment pathways covered or observed within the data. And then other issues like sample size, follow-up, and currency or the recency of data. And we recognize in the framework that there are often trade-offs between these different components of relevance, as well as data quality. So, for example, when we're thinking about studies of comparative effectiveness, it can be quite difficult to get hold of UK data. In oncology, we have a quite good national data set, which could be used to answer some of these questions, but it can be difficult to access in a timely fashion. So we increasingly see companies submitting data from the US, from the likes of Flatiron, Concert AI, Cota, and others. And there's a recognition that this data can be useful because it can provide us with that information which allows us to match patient eligibility criteria to deal with some of the confounding factors, and so on, even though there's questions about the generalizability. And this concept of generalizability is quite a complex one and varies very much depending on the use case, the type of evidence, and so on. And I might come back to that at the end. I just also want to mention that we have developed something called the Data Suitability Assessment Tool, or DataSat, which is intended to support the consistent and structured reporting of this information to help our committees in interpreting these studies and making recommendations. As I said, we provided general guidance studies, including descriptor studies, but we provide a bit more information on comparative effectiveness studies. And again, there's nothing especially groundbreaking here and nothing that should be surprising to many of you, but I think many of the concepts that we introduce here are not well known in the HTA world and certainly not well reflected in previous submissions to HTA bodies like NICE. So we put a lot of emphasis on good study design and recommend the target trial approach. We also provide guidance around dealing with confounders, missing data, and measurement error. But we recognize that however good the study design, however appropriate the statistical methods may seem, there are often going to be remaining concerns about residual bias, and that these should be explored using various sensitivity and bias analysis techniques. So I want to just come on to the target trial, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but I wanted to try and identify some of the components of this in our guidance. This might be particular to HTA or more emphasized within a HTA use cases. So I've just noted a few down here. So in terms of eligibility criteria, for most studies, we're really interested in reflecting clinical pathways in patients seen in routine care at the NHS. When we're using external control arms in comparison to single arm trials, the focus is a little bit different, and it's really about trying to get an internally valid estimate of effects and matching as closely as possible to that single arm trial, which often won't represent the clinical pathway in the NHS. In terms of treatment strategies, again, we're interested in local standard of care. We're interested in strategies that reflect local care pathways. And I think in terms of the other things, these are relatively familiar and consistent with most other use cases in the regulatory setting. In terms of outcomes, as I said before, we're interested in how a patient functions, feels, or how long they survive. We're less interested in surrogate outcomes like progression-free survival or objective response rate in oncology. And where these are used, we want to see good evidence that they're causally associated with changes in final outcomes. But often these are the primary outcomes in clinical trials, including single-arm uncontrolled studies. Causal effective interest, this is perhaps the more interesting column. So when we're making decisions, as I said earlier, we really are thinking of a treatment policy estimand, although this is implicit. We don't currently use the language of estimands. And that is, a treatment will initially be prescribed. The patients will stop adhering to that. They might switch treatments, they might pass away, and so on. And we're interested in what happens to that patient over their lifetime. So this depends on what their second line treatment might be, what they go to after the initial treatment, for example. So that's what we're really interested in for measures of clinical effectiveness. But of course, other estimands might be of interest for other outcomes, like safety, for example, where on-treatment studies might be more appropriate, or for some studies we might not get reliable aspects trying to follow a treatment policy estimand, so we might have to compromise in terms of the evidence that is generated. I think it's just worth noting while talking about estimands that trials do not always estimate the estimand that's needed for HTA. And this, of course, includes when using single-arm trials. HTA bodies like NICE often profess a preference for average treatment effects, but we regularly also accept average treatment effects on the treated and in overlap groups as well. And I think there's less consensus on this, and uncertainty actually about what's appropriate. Just time, as I want to leave plenty for Q&A. So I've just got a few slides left. So in terms of sensitivity analysis, I touched on this earlier, and we try and put a lot of emphasis on this. And this is very consistent with the way that health technology assessment decisions are made. As I said earlier, we rely on modeling to try and estimate costs and benefits of treatments over patient lifetime. We don't observe this directly, so there's lots of uncertainties in this process. And we explore, and lots of data that goes into these models. And we explore these uncertainties using various forms of probabilistic sensitivity analysis, where we identify distributions for our different input variables and simulate these in a Monte Carlo process, but also deterministic sensitivity analyses where we change particular parameters or combination of parameters. And this should be extended to include estimates of effectiveness coming from real-world evidence. And this can be used either to understand the extent to which bias would have to be change study conclusions or reimbursement decisions, or to estimate the impact of bias on estimates of clinical and cost effectiveness as well. So propagating it through from clinical to cost effectiveness. And we're involved in a number of research projects around this, including two called Q-Basel and T-Basel, which are about the use of QBA for external control arm studies in non-small cell lung cancer. And this includes collaborators from industry and also from Harvard Medical School, including Miguel. So the framework hasn't ended. It's not meant to be a one-off document that exists, and we want to keep it up to date. It's a living framework. So we intend to update it next year, reflecting advances in this area. As you all know, this is an area where there are many improvements, many advances being made on a regular basis. And we want to ensure the latest knowledge, scientific understanding is reflected in the framework so that it continues to be of value to us and our stakeholders. We might also extend to include additional priority topics. And I might come onto this in the next slide. At the moment, our main focus is really about the implementation of this framework, ensuring that it doesn't just exist as a nice document, but something that makes a change and improves the evidence we get and improves the way that we use evidence, ensuring that we do use it to fill evidence gaps, improve recommendations, and speed up access to effective, innovative technologies. So I wanted to end just by identifying some of those areas I struggled a little bit in trying to develop this guidance, and where further questions came up during our consultation. I thought I'd present it to this group, as many of you are excellent methodologists who might be working on some of these questions, and I'd love to hear from you if you are. So I started a small list and it got longer and longer, so I'm not going to list all of them. I think areas that are particularly challenging were around unstructured data and what we can expect here in terms of how unstructured data is converted into full study variables, for example. What can reasonably shared and what can we do with that information? How can this be validated, for example? I think we really love the work that was done as part of RCT duplicate and similar studies, and this has been extremely useful in informing the work that we've done. And I think this is very useful for exploring how we can use real-world evidence in the future to improve our recommendations. The main current challenge we have is around external control arms, and I think we'd benefit from project similar scale looking specifically in this area. And unfortunately at NICE, we're not really in a financial position to fund such massive projects, but we hope that others will. I think there's questions around that often come up in our evaluations around which propensity score models are most appropriate for different situations. Sometimes we see matching, sometimes weighting. The justification or the explanations aren't always there, and it's not always clear to committees what would have been most appropriate. And given the and lack of pre-specification currently concerns over whether this is selective or not. And similarly, uncertainties about which effects we should be requesting or using in our decision making. Another hot topic that has come up a fair bit is around synthesizing evidence from randomized and non-randomized studies. There's been a few very good papers on this recently, but I think a lack of consensus still about what is the best and most appropriate way of doing this. And then a final one, which I wanted to highlight, is around rational data. So as I said earlier, we do increasingly see US data particularly submitted to NICE as part of its submissions as external control arms. And there are important questions that committees regularly have about the extent to which this translates into patients treated in the NHS. And of course, this depends on the outcomes that you're interested in. It's likely to be easier for relative outcomes rather than absolute outcomes. It might depend on the disease area and many other areas. The questions, but I think this is an area that we're really interested in understanding more about in order to improve our decision making and making the optimal use of data. So with that, I will end the presentation. Again, thank you all for coming, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Seamus. I want to congratulate you on putting such a comprehensive document out, which is very thoughtful regarding some of the challenges that are really, we are dealing with some of the same issues that you mentioned. So I really want to thank you for highlighting those for us. For the attendees, I would like to remind you that your lines are still muted. If you want to pose a question, please paste it in the Q&A box that you have at the bottom of your screen. And while people are thinking about questions, one that I would like to start with, I think you touched on it a bit, but something that we have been thinking about a lot is that, as you said, many of the elements in the framework are building on published principles and published methodological papers. One area we find really challenging with very little methodological guidance is the role of feasibility type of analysis in when you're talking about real world evidence or secondary data, because these data exist. So protocol specification is a great initiative and should be used as much as possible. But then when you start thinking about how far that document goes, have you considered outlining some guidance around what does a feasibility type analysis look like without kind of compromising the validity or the outcome planning principle, let's say. So I wanted to ask you if that has come up or if this is something that you guys are thinking about.
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely something that we're aware of and something of a concern, the extent to which that sort of feasibility analysis can eke in. You want it to inform the study, and that's it's in the name, isn't it? But you obviously don't want it to lead to selective choices and so on. So I think we haven't put much in about it. It's true. I think we ideally would like to have clarity about how companies are going about approaching this. So identifying data sources, what criteria they're using to select these, what they're doing with this data in order to make that decision, and kind of perhaps statements potentially about with the data might be useful. But I think it requires further thoughts, I would say.
Thank you. Yeah. So there are a couple of questions in the chat box which I will read. So one of the questions asks if NICE would be interested in partnering with other entities in purely methodological type of work for specific data sources of interest.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're doing a few projects in collaboration with various partners, more where they relate to to challenges that we're commonly facing and can help us better understand these or perhaps find solutions. So reach out to us if you are interested, and we can have further discussions about it.
Great, thank you. As other questions come up, I had one more question of my own. So one of the other things that we have been dealing with in putting together these types of guidances or documents is really variability in the terminology that we use. Although this might sound semantic and not as important, but it's really matters to people. So for example, we in observational or causal inference type of research, we'll use estimand to mean a really specific thing. And if you go to like ICH guidelines, for example, for the trials community, they use estimand in a slightly different context to be more inclusive. So I was wondering, this is just an example, but I had come across challenges in clearly communicating differences or similarities between these specific terms, and how have you dealt with this?
Yes, I mean, I could probably think of 100 terms or more from the framework where it was a bit challenging. Things, data provenance, for example, you see different definitions in different documents. Real world data, there's lots of different definitions. I mean, they broadly, I think people kind of know what is meant by it, even if they do. So it is a challenge. I mean, we have tried to align sort of starting nationally. So, we have a regulator called the MHRA, and we try to make sure our language around sort of data quality and real world data kind of is aligning with that in the first instance. They are pretty aligned, I think, with the EMA, having been part of that before, and so on. So it kind of emanates out from that. It's a persistent challenge, and will continue to be so, I think. But yeah, I'm trying to think whether I can add any more of interest to that. We try and perhaps it'll have some influence over. No, I'm starting to babble, but I think there's areas where it doesn't matter that much. There's slightly different meanings, but there's areas where we really need to try and nail this down. And estimand is probably a good example of that, where we do need to have a common understanding, especially as it's a new term. I think it gives us enough to do that more concretely.
That's great, thank you. And I was also wondering about if you had or if you're going, I know the current document doesn't include this, and you mentioned it as one of the uncertainty areas, but I was wondering if you are going or moving towards kind of recommending specific statistical analysis methods, for example, for specific type of questions. Is that an avenue that you think you will be moving to next?
At the moment, we decided not to do that, but I think as our understanding of which methods are preferred and in which circumstances improves, then we would want to perhaps be a bit tighter in this. But I sort of mentioned in one of the last slides, there remain uncertainties about what methods are appropriate, and I think we've on with the approach of asking companies to justify why they've chosen a certain method, and explore this with sensitivity.
Great. There is also a question that just rolled in from an anonymous attendee who asks, real-world data sometimes do not capture patient preferences, for instance, patient-centered outcomes. How does NICE deal with this type of issue in the HTAs?
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge because NICE are particularly interested in decision-making in patient-reported outcomes. So we have sort of various projects, involvement team who kind of do work around trying to encourage the collection of this data. but we also try and look at other data sources as well, such as patient surveys, patient experience data. But yeah, I think it's an area where there would be massive value in having this data collected more routinely, particularly for health technology assessment bodies who use patient-reported outcomes quite a lot in decision making.
Thank you. And we don't have any other question in the chat box, but I can probably ask one more. So maybe this is just really naive question, but have you been in situations where you receive not a formal submission, but some kind of communication with a study sponsor at the protocol stage using some of the principles that you find there, and based on kind of your feedback, that process, or have you ever said that this submission will not be complete until you provide us with this type of additional information, that type of back and forth, I guess, is what I'm asking. Is it routine with NICE, or is it that doesn't happen?
Yeah, we have processes that allow that. So we have a sort of initial technical engagements with companies in NICE. We have a sort of interim stage in our decision making where we hear the evidence from committees and from our expert panel, and produce a kind of consultation document essentially with a preliminary decision, which informs the kind of further work that's done by the company. Now that we've developed this framework as well as our general this year, there'll be more focus in these engagements on top of, say, real world evidence.
Great. Okay, so I don't think we have any more questions in the chat box. But Dr. Kent, I really enjoyed your presentation, and congratulations once again for putting out a really comprehensive document for all of us to really look up to and use as we think about our guidances. So thank you for taking the time again today. And just as a quick reminder for all the attendees, these presentation will be made available on the website.
Thank you, Rishi. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.